The racist and corrupt officer laughed in her face the moment the words left her lips. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't raising her voice or causing a scene. She simply stood at the entrance of the courthouse, calmly stating her position as a federal judge, requesting to pass through the security line like she had done hundreds of times before. But that day, something was different. That day, she wasn't wearing her black robe. She wasn't carrying her ID badge. She wasn't surrounded by bailiffs or law clerks. She was just a black woman, alone, dressed in a simple blazer, holding a manila envelope, and trying to enter the building she worked in. And to that officer, that alone was enough to spark the humiliation that would change everything. "Oh, a federal judge, huh?" he chuckled sarcastically, his eyes scanning her with open disgust. "You gonna tell me next you're the president too?" He crossed his arms, shook his head, and gestured toward the bench near the entrance. "Have a seat, ma'am. Don't embarrass yourself more than you already have. You'll get your turn like the rest of them. If you're lucky, maybe the judge'll go easy on you today." People turned to look. Laughter spread around. One woman clutched her purse a little tighter, slowly inching away. The officer's partner leaned in and whispered something with a grin, while the other security personnel exchanged looks that said they were used to this, not the claim, but the dismissal. It was casual cruelty, the kind that wears a uniform and a smirk, confident in the idea that no black woman standing alone in that hallway could possibly be anything close to what she claimed. And in that moment, she didn't respond. No anger. No shouting. Just stillness. And silence. But behind her eyes, a storm began to build. Because what the officer didn't know was that she wasn't lost. She wasn't mistaken. And she sure as hell wasn't there to be judged. She was the judge. What happened next will leave you speechless. The story unfolded inside that very courthouse, just minutes later, when the same officer who mocked her, with that smug, entitled tone so deeply rooted in ignorance and privilege, found himself escorted into a courtroom, hands clasped in front of him, forced to sit at the defendant's table. It wasn't part of some random incident. No. This had been building for months. Maybe years. The evidence stacked high. The investigations moving quietly. And the final piece of the puzzle? That envelope in her hand. That envelope wasn't a resume. It wasn't a complaint. It was the final notice of her reassignment, to preside over the federal corruption trial involving a series of brutal and racially motivated arrests, all led by that same officer. And in a twist that only real life could deliver, the judge assigned to hear the case was none other than the black woman he had humiliated at the door. She didn't need to introduce herself when she stepped into the courtroom. The look on his face said everything. But let's go back. Because this story didn't start there. It started with power. With the kind of power that doesn't need a uniform or a badge to be dangerous. The kind that hides behind sarcasm, behind policies, behind the illusion of, just doing my job. It started the moment someone decided that appearances mattered more than truth. That race, gender, and the absence of formal symbols of status were enough to strip a person of respect. It started when that man decided to mock a black woman for claiming her rightful place. And what made it worse, what made it burn, was the ease with which he dismissed her. As if the very idea of her being a judge was laughable. As if her voice, her presence, her years of sacrifice and service could be erased with one chuckle and a few cutting words. That moment wasn't just about disrespect. It was about erasure. About how quickly the world tells black women, you don't belong here. You don't matter here. But this story is about what happens when they're wrong. Because what no one in that hallway knew was that her entire career had been forged in fire. That she'd spent her life breaking down doors that were never meant to open for her. That she had worked through the nights, faced discrimination at every stage of her journey, and still rose, not in spite of it, but because of it. And on that day, when she walked into the courthouse with no robe, no badge, and no entourage, she carried with her the weight of 1,000 humiliations, and the power to turn one of them into justice. She didn't need to scream to make herself heard. Her silence was the warning. Her presence was the storm. And when she took the bench, all the laughter stopped. The trial that followed exposed far more than a single man's corruption. It revealed a network of deceit, a pattern of abuse, and a culture of silence that allowed it all to continue. It uncovered hidden body cam footage, redacted reports, forged statements, and a system rigged against those who dared to speak up. And at the center of it all, the man who had laughed at her that morning, now sitting with his face drained of color, his smirk long gone, and his fate resting in the hands of the very woman he tried to degrade. What do you do when the person you mocked holds your future in their hands? What happens when justice stops being theoretical, and becomes personal? This story isn't just about karma. It's about dignity. It's about standing tall when the world tries to shrink you. It's about knowing who you are even when no one else does. And it's about what happens when a system built to suppress is forced to face the truth. But here's the part no one expected. Because just when everyone thought the final twist had landed, when the trial was reaching its dramatic peak, something else happened. Something that even she didn't see coming. Something that made every camera in the room turn. That changed the story once again. That made the whole nation stop and say, wait, what did she just do? And that is the moment that turned this from a courtroom story, into something much bigger. Are you ready to find out what happened inside that courtroom? Because trust me, you don't want to miss the moment she flipped the entire room upside down. Stay with us. The story is just getting started. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every Black viewer watching this. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in justice, dignity, and the power of storytelling to expose painful truths and inspire powerful change. You are seen. You are valued. And your voice matters. Now, get ready for a story that will leave you speechless. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Her name was Aaliyah Monroe, and for most of her life, she'd walked into rooms where people never expected her to belong. Not because she lacked the credentials. Not because she wasn't the smartest person in the room, because often, she was. But because Aaliyah was a Black woman in America, and that meant every achievement, every title, every degree, every ounce of her strength, had to fight its way through a wall of assumptions before anyone even saw her. She was 42 years old, a Harvard Law graduate, daughter of a public school teacher and a sanitation worker from Birmingham, Alabama, and one of the youngest Black women ever appointed to the federal bench in the Southern District of Georgia. Yet none of that shielded her from the stares. From the dismissals. From the moments that reminded her, over and over again, that no matter how high she climbed, some people would always try to pull her back down just by pretending she didn't exist. The courthouse in downtown Atlanta wasn't unfamiliar to her. The old white columns. The metal detectors that beeped even when your pockets were empty. The officers who greeted certain faces with warmth and others with suspicion. It was the same courthouse where she had worked as a public defender straight out of law school. The same building where she argued her first trial, trembling but determined. And later, the same courthouse where her name was engraved on the wall behind the judge's bench. But that morning, she hadn't come through the private entrance like she usually did. That morning, her car had broken down just 6 blocks away. A flat tire on a morning already packed with significance. She wasn't in her full robes. She didn't have a clerk by her side. She wore a plain navy blazer over a white blouse, sensible flats, and carried a single envelope containing the official judicial reassignment paperwork that would place her on one of the most high-profile cases in her circuit that year. She had walked the 6 blocks in the early humidity of the Georgia spring, her hair pinned up, her skin glistening from the warmth, with nothing about her appearance to suggest her position, nothing that would protect her from the assumptions waiting at the courthouse entrance. But Aaliyah was used to that. Used to knowing that, without the symbols of authority, her very presence in some spaces was seen as a challenge. She had learned to walk anyway. Inside the building, Officer Brent Callahan stood with his thumb hooked on his belt, leaning just slightly to one side, a posture that radiated arrogance more than ease. Brent had been on the force for almost 15 years. His father had been a cop. His older brother too. The badge wasn't just a job to him, it was a family legacy, a source of pride. But pride without self-reflection can turn into something poisonous. Brent saw himself as a protector of the law, but only the kind of law he believed in. The one that rewarded those who looked like him and punished those who didn't. The kind of law that made him feel like the gatekeeper of the American dream, deciding who got to come through the doors and who had to sit down and wait. He had a way of sizing people up instantly, deciding, based on clothes, skin tone, posture, what they deserved. So when Aaliyah walked through those doors without a badge, without someone to vouch for her, without the polished entourage that usually surrounded the people who sat behind the bench, Brent didn't even look twice before making his decision. To him, she was just another woman, just another black woman, who thought too much of herself. The worst kind, in his view. The kind who walked with pride instead of gratitude. The kind who didn't bow their head when authority raised its voice. His partner, Officer Doyle, younger and quieter, glanced at Aaliyah with less judgment but said nothing. Doyle had only been on the job a few years. He wasn't as aggressive as Brent, but he also wasn't bold enough to challenge him. He'd seen Brent cross the line before, rough language during traffic stops, unnecessary frisks, choosing which IDs to check based on skin tone. But Doyle told himself it wasn't his place. That it wasn't his fight. That morning, he would once again choose silence over discomfort. As Aaliyah approached the checkpoint, Brent didn't even bother to ask for ID. He just smirked. "You here to observe court proceedings today?" he said, with that tone that didn't need to raise its volume to carry condescension. "I'm here for courtroom 3, Aaliyah replied, calm but firm. Brent raised his eyebrows, as if the request itself were absurd. "Courtroom 3? He leaned back and chuckled, then turned to Doyle. "We've got another one. Thinks she's the judge." Aaliyah didn't flinch. She'd been here before, not in this exact moment, but in its thousands of variations. Still, she tried once more. "I am the judge." Brent whistled low and shook his head. "All right, ma'am. Why don't you take a seat right over there? When your name gets called, you can explain all that to the real judge." The humiliation didn't come from his words alone. It came from the snickering of the other people in line. From the way he gestured toward the waiting area like she was some kind of distraction. From the fact that he hadn't even considered verifying her claim, because, to him, the idea of a black woman in that position was so far-fetched it didn't deserve inquiry. The sting wasn't just personal. It was ancestral. It was centuries of denial packed into a single dismissive moment. And as she sat, for just a moment, not out of obedience but out of calculation, she felt the weight of every black girl who had ever been told she wasn't enough. Who had been laughed at for dreaming too big. Who had to work twice as hard to get half the respect. But Aaliyah wasn't a girl anymore. And she wasn't going to wait long. The courtroom upstairs was already buzzing. Cameras were being set up. Reporters had taken their seats. The trial set to begin was no ordinary one. It was a federal investigation into internal corruption within the Atlanta Police Department, tied to allegations of fabricated evidence, racially biased arrests, and systematic abuse of power. The case had already claimed the careers of several officers. But the biggest name on the list, just added the week prior, was Brent Callahan. No one in the courtroom knew who would be presiding yet. The judge had been reassigned last minute. The defense was tense. The prosecution confident. A line of witnesses had been prepped, many of them community members who had been mistreated or falsely arrested over the past decade. This was a case about power, race, and the illusion of justice, and no one knew just how symbolic the opening moments were about to become. Aaliyah stood. Smoothed her jacket. And walked toward the private entrance behind the courtroom, where a clerk, who did recognize her, escorted her swiftly to the chambers to prepare for proceedings. She didn't need to say a word about what had happened downstairs. Not yet. The time for silence had passed. But the time for justice, that was just beginning. Inside the courtroom, Brent sat stiffly in his chair, jaw tight, sweat beading along his hairline. The smirk was gone. His lawyer whispered instructions. The air was tense, thick with anticipation. And when the doors opened and Aaliyah stepped up to the bench, the entire room shifted. There was no mistaking her authority now. No mistaking the robe, the posture, the command in her voice when she opened the session. Brent's face drained of color. Doyle looked away. The reporters raised their cameras. And though no one could see it, beneath that calm exterior, Aaliyah allowed herself a single, quiet thought. Now we begin. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet tension that felt almost unnatural. Every movement was sharp. Every sound seemed to echo. Aaliyah sat behind the bench with a calm so deliberate it was unnerving, her expression unreadable but her presence undeniable. Across the room, Brent sat in a tailored navy suit, far from his usual uniform, but the stiffness in his posture betrayed the confidence his lawyers tried to dress him in. He avoided her gaze, but the discomfort in his eyes betrayed what he couldn't say out loud. He knew exactly who she was. The judge he had mocked. The woman he had laughed at. The same woman now holding the gavel that would shape his future. And she hadn't said a word about it. Not yet. That silence haunted him more than any outburst ever could. The opening arguments were clinical. The assistant U.S. attorney, Camila Rojas, was precise and relentless. She spoke of years of abuse hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy, of countless victims who had been silenced by fear or circumstance, and of a pattern so unmistakable that even those who wanted to deny it could no longer pretend. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words cut cleanly, leaving no room for doubt. This is not just a case about misconduct, she said, turning toward the jury with fire in her eyes. This is about betrayal. About someone entrusted to serve the law choosing instead to twist it for personal gain and prejudice. And today, that ends. Brent's defense attorney, Gregory Harlan, followed with all the performative indignation of a seasoned white-collar lawyer defending the indefensible. He painted Brent as a decorated officer, a community servant, a man who had made tough choices in difficult moments. He framed the accusations as overreactions, the witnesses as unreliable, and the evidence as circumstantial. You will see that this case, he said, gesturing dramatically, is built on assumptions and emotions, not facts. And when you strip away the outrage, you'll see a man who did his job the best way he knew how. Aaliyah listened to both sides with the practiced neutrality her position required. But behind her composed exterior, every word struck a different chord. This wasn't just another trial. This was personal, but not in the petty, retaliatory sense her critics might one day try to claim. It was personal because she had seen the consequences of men like Brent before. In her father, pulled over and humiliated in front of his daughter for driving a beat-up truck through a wealthy suburb. In her teenage cousin, slammed against a fence outside a convenience store just for walking home too late. In herself, told again and again, subtly and overtly, that her place was not where she stood now. And most of all, it was personal because this case was about more than Brent. It was about the system that allowed Brent to thrive. As the first witnesses began to testify, the courtroom leaned in, figuratively and literally. A young black man named Jermaine recounted the night he was stopped for a broken taillight and ended up in jail for resisting arrest, despite no evidence of aggression. His voice cracked only once, when he mentioned missing the birth of his daughter because he was locked up. The silence that followed was heavy, but Aaliyah didn't flinch. She simply nodded and motioned for him to continue. Then came Melissa Garvey, a middle-aged nurse who testified about her teenage son being arrested on false charges that were later dropped, but not before he spent 6 nights in juvenile detention. Her hands trembled on the stand. "He doesn't sleep right anymore," she said. He jumps every time a cop car drives past. My son was never the same after that. Each story layered upon the last, a tapestry of pain and fear that painted a damning portrait. Brent's face grew tighter with every testimony. He occasionally leaned in to whisper to Harlan, but more often than not, his eyes stayed fixed on the floor, a man beginning to realize that his world was shrinking. That the safety he had long felt, the unspoken immunity that came with his badge, was slipping away with every word spoken into that microphone. Behind the scenes, Aaliyah met with her clerk between sessions. Malik, a sharp and loyal young man who had worked with her since her first day on the bench, watched her carefully. "You okay?" he asked once they were alone. She nodded but didn't speak. He could tell the weight of it was heavy, but he also knew she carried it well. "You don't have to prove anything," he added softly. "Not to him. Not to anyone." She finally looked at him. "I'm not proving anything," she said, her voice steady. "I'm delivering what he thought he'd never have to face. Accountability." By the end of the second day, the media had caught wind of the irony. Headlines danced around the unspoken truth, that the judge hearing the case had been publicly humiliated by the very man now facing trial. They didn't have footage, just whispers, but the narrative was too poetic to ignore. Still, Aaliyah said nothing. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She wasn't here for a soundbite. She was here for the truth. During cross-examinations, Brent's defense tried to poke holes in every timeline, discredit every memory, question every motive. But the stories held. They were too real. Too raw. The inconsistencies his team hoped to exploit never appeared. And what Brent couldn't defend against was the consistency of fear, how each witness, from different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, told stories soaked in the same dread. The dread of being seen not as citizens, but as threats. After court adjourned one evening, Brent was seen pacing in the hallway outside, his voice rising as he snapped at Harlan. "She's got it out for me," he hissed, not knowing Aaliyah stood just around the corner. "This whole damn thing's a setup." Harlan tried to calm him, to remind him that judges had to remain impartial. But Brent wasn't listening. "You don't get it," he barked. "She wants revenge. That woman's dangerous." But what Brent didn't understand, what he would never truly grasp, was that this wasn't about revenge. If it were, Aaliyah could have ended his reputation the moment he laughed in her face. She could have demanded an apology, made a scene, played the victim. But she didn't. Because this was never about making him feel what she felt. It was about ensuring that no one else ever had to feel it again. The tension inside the courtroom mounted with each passing hour. The jury, once distant, now leaned forward in their seats. The reporters typed faster. The whispers grew louder. Something was building, something bigger than just a verdict. A shift. A reckoning. And though no one could name it yet, everyone felt it in their bones. One morning, as Aaliyah prepared to enter the courtroom, Malik handed her a sealed folder. "This just came in. New evidence. From Internal Affairs." She opened it and froze. It was a transcript. A report. And something else, something that changed the entire landscape of the trial. Malik saw the change in her expression. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up slowly, eyes burning not with anger, but with something deeper. "It's everything." But she didn't explain. She didn't say another word. She simply stood, straightened her robe, and walked into the courtroom like a storm on the horizon. Something was coming. Something no one was prepared for. And when it landed, it would silence the room, and change everything. The courtroom lights felt hotter that morning. Not literally, but in the way the air carried something unspoken. Reporters who had shown up out of curiosity were now leaning forward with the urgency of people sensing history in motion. Jurors sat tighter, their eyes darting between the witness stand and the bench. Even the sound of footsteps carried weight. And as Judge Aaliyah Monroe entered from the chambers, her presence seemed to shift something invisible in the room, like pressure in the air before a storm breaks. She wasn't rushing. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like a woman who knew the ground she walked on had been laid by generations of struggle. But what no one in the room yet knew was that the folder she had received the previous night didn't just include supplemental reports. It carried within it the turning point of the entire trial, a revelation capable of collapsing the narrative Brent Callahan had so carefully built around himself. Aaliyah adjusted the microphone. She didn't look at Brent. Not yet. Instead, she addressed the courtroom with measured gravity. We've received additional material evidence from internal affairs, and the court has reviewed it in chambers. This evidence will now be introduced for the jury's consideration. It contains audio and visual material, authenticated and time-stamped, from a previously unreported internal camera installed in the northwest corridor of Precinct 7. Brent's attorney stiffened. Your Honor, we respectfully request time to review this material before it is shown to the jury. That request is denied, she said without pause. This evidence is directly relevant to the testimonies already presented. The court will proceed. The screen to the side of the courtroom flickered to life. The footage wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was grainy. Still. A hallway. A corner of a police station. But the voices, those were clear. Brent's voice, unmistakable, arrogant, rang out. She said she was a judge, bro. A judge. I swear, I almost choked. She stood there like she owned the damn place, like we're supposed to bow or something just because she's got a mouth on her. His partner's voice followed, quieter, more hesitant. You sure she wasn't, though? I mean, something felt different about her. Brent laughed. A cold, guttural sound. Different? What's different? She was just another loud black woman trying to feel important. They're all the same. Play the part until someone calls the bluff. Silence followed in the room. Thick. Suffocating. One of the jurors shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A reporter's hand trembled slightly as he typed. Brent sat frozen. His face, normally tight with defensiveness, now betrayed something else entirely, recognition. Not just that he had been caught, but that his words had been preserved. Echoed. Played in front of a room he had once ruled by presence alone. Aaliyah didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This footage, she said, her voice steady as stone, was recovered during a separate internal audit and submitted to the court by an anonymous source within the department. It corroborates concerns brought forth by multiple witnesses and challenges the defense's claim that Mr. Callahan was acting in good faith during his encounters. Brent finally spoke, low and hoarse. That video's out of context. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but Brent wasn't listening anymore. His eyes locked onto Aaliyah's for the first time since she had taken the bench. Something about that look, something between panic and disbelief, made the air drop 10 degrees. She didn't look away. Mr. Callahan, she said, leaning forward, do you recognize your voice in that recording? He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then finally, with a dry swallow, nodded. The courtroom was still. Aaliyah turned to the jury. Let the record reflect that the defendant has acknowledged the recording as authentic and his own. The trial didn't end there, but something fundamental shifted. Witnesses no longer spoke with hesitation. They spoke with the strength that comes when truth is no longer a fragile thing. Aaliyah allowed the proceedings to continue with fairness, but the silence in the room was no longer heavy with fear, it had transformed into something sharper. Expectant. As if justice, after circling the perimeter for so long, had finally stepped forward to speak. At recess, Brent sat slouched at the defense table, his face pale. He didn't look at the reporters, or his lawyer, or anyone. For the first time, he looked small. Not because he was being punished, but because he had lost something more than his authority, he had lost the illusion of untouchability. His defense team scrambled to adjust strategy, but the truth was that the weight of his words had already done more damage than any cross-examination ever could. Back in chambers, Malik stood near the door, arms crossed. "So, that tape. You knew it was coming?" Aaliyah looked up from her notes. "Not until last night. Do you think someone inside the department finally grew a conscience?" "I think someone got tired of watching people suffer in silence," she said softly. "Sometimes justice doesn't come from the top. Sometimes it comes from the margins." Malik nodded, but there was something heavier in his expression. "Do you think he knows?" Aaliyah met his eyes. "Knows what?" "That it was you at the entrance that day. That this all started because he couldn't see past his own prejudice." A pause. Then, with the slightest curve of her lips, "He knows now." Later that afternoon, Aaliyah announced that the prosecution would be allowed to recall Brent to the stand. The defense objected loudly, citing Fifth Amendment protections, but Brent, whether out of arrogance, pride, or the fading hope he could still control the narrative, agreed to speak. And when he took the stand, the room once again fell into a kind of sacred hush. Camila Rojas stepped forward slowly. "Officer Callahan, do you believe your role as a law enforcement officer requires you to treat all citizens equally?" Brent hesitated. "Yes." "Do you believe your actions, as heard in that recording, align with that oath?" I was angry. It was a stressful day. People say things they don't mean. "Were you angry because a woman of color challenged your authority?" He shifted in the seat. "I wasn't thinking about her race." "And yet you referred to her as, just another loud black woman. That's specific." "It was a joke," he said, forcing a half smile. "Locker room talk." Camila didn't flinch. "Except it wasn't a locker room. It was a precinct. And it wasn't a joke. It was an admission." She paused, then turned to the judge. "No further questions." Aaliyah sat still. Watching. Measuring. She hadn't spoken directly to him since the trial began. But now, as he stepped down from the witness box, their eyes met again. He stopped. As if something in that gaze held him there. As if the weight of everything unsaid had finally caught up to him. And then, she spoke, not as a judge delivering a ruling, but as a human being who had carried too many quiet burdens for too long. "You called me a liar," she said evenly, not to humiliate, but to state a fact. "You didn't ask for my name. You didn't ask for my credentials. You just saw me and decided who I was." Brent didn't respond. He couldn't. "You had no idea the role I played in your future," she continued, "because you were too busy laughing at my past." And then she raised her gavel. "Court will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements. No theatrics. No raised voices." But the room sat still for a long time after she left. Something irreversible had happened. But what no one knew, was that the biggest twist hadn't arrived yet. Because the envelope that delivered the footage wasn't just anonymous, it came with a letter. A letter written by someone no one ever expected to turn. And when the contents of that letter are revealed, they will turn this trial upside down. Completely. The courtroom returned to order the next morning, but something in the atmosphere had changed. The weight of the previous day's revelations hadn't settled, it lingered, thick in the silence between footsteps, in the way the jurors glanced at one another without speaking, in the way Brent sat straighter in his chair but didn't make eye contact with anyone, especially not with Aaliyah. The envelope, the one that contained the video, had also held a second item, a handwritten letter, unsigned, that detailed not only the existence of the hidden footage, but revealed a deeper rot within the department. It named names. Detailed strategies. Described how Brent had instructed subordinates to exaggerate reports, falsify charges, and in some cases, completely fabricate probable cause for arrests in minority neighborhoods. But what made it more chilling, more impactful, was who had written it. Aaliyah sat with the letter laid into the night before. Reading it once. Twice. A third time. Her hands didn't shake, but her breathing slowed with each line. The handwriting was careful, almost too careful, as if the writer had rewritten it multiple times before finally mailing it. And then she reached the bottom of the page. No signature. Just 2 words, "Forgive me." Now, in the courtroom, Camila Rojas stood once more. Her tone was more deliberate now, her every word heavier with purpose. She held up a printed copy of the letter and addressed the jury. This document was submitted by an anonymous source within the Atlanta Police Department. Its authenticity is still being verified, but its contents align with previously known facts and timelines that we have established in court. She turned slightly, her eyes falling on Brent, who tried to maintain composure but whose fingers betrayed him, tapping nervously against the table, twitching in a slow, spiraling rhythm. In this letter, Camila continued, the author confesses to participating in unethical practices under the instruction of Officer Brent Callahan. Practices including, but not limited to, manipulation of arrest records, strategic targeting of Black and Latino citizens, and retaliatory policing against individuals who filed complaints. Brent's attorney rose, objecting, insisting that an unsigned letter without verification should not be admissible. But Aaliyah leaned forward, her tone firm and unwavering. Objection noted. The letter will be admitted under Rule 807, residual exception, pending authentication. The jury is instructed to consider the content in light of the corroborating evidence already presented. The moment was surgical. Controlled. But beneath the surface, it felt volcanic. Like something old and buried had finally cracked open. Camila walked to the center of the courtroom. We cannot confirm who wrote the letter, she said slowly. But I will ask Officer Callahan directly, on the record, were you aware of efforts within your department to intentionally target communities of color? Brent shifted uncomfortably. No, were you aware of your subordinates falsifying reports under your supervision? No, he said again, but this time his voice faltered. Did you instruct officers to prioritize stops in neighborhoods that you internally referred to as high profile? I don't recall using that term, he muttered. Would it surprise you if I told you that the exact phrase, high-profile zones appears in 5 separate internal emails connected to you? He didn't answer. Camila stepped forward again, closer now. Officer Callahan, I'm going to ask you one final time. Do you know who wrote this letter? Brent's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked toward the gallery. And then, for a split second, he looked at the table behind the prosecution, where a young man sat with his hands folded, eyes low. Officer Doyle. Brent's former partner. Sitting silent for days. Now called to testify. A hush fell over the room as Doyle walked to the stand. He looked thinner than he had before, older in a way that didn't come from age but from the weight of conscience. As he raised his hand and swore in, Aaliyah watched him closely. Something in his gait, in his silence, had always felt unfinished. Now it was clear, he hadn't been waiting to be called. He had been waiting to speak. Camila began gently. Officer Doyle, do you recognize the handwriting in this letter? He nodded slowly. Yes. Whose handwriting is it? Doyle cleared his throat, and then said, mine. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Brent's lawyer stood halfway up from his seat but was waved down by Aaliyah before he could object. Brent sat frozen, unmoving, his mouth slightly open as if air had been snatched from the room. You wrote the letter? Camila asked again. I did. Why? Doyle swallowed hard. Because I was tired of watching it happen. Tired of pretending I didn't see it. Tired of justifying it to myself. When I first joined, I thought I could do good. But I fell in line. We all did. We were told it was about keeping the streets safe. But it wasn't. It was about numbers. Arrest quotas. Reputation. There were days we'd pick people at random just to meet the numbers. And Brent, he was the ringleader. He paused, his voice cracking. I wrote that letter because I needed to start telling the truth, even if it meant burning everything behind me. Brent finally erupted. You're lying. You're doing this to save yourself. But Doyle didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Aaliyah. No, I'm doing this because for the first time, someone's actually listening. Brent stood up, ignoring his lawyer's grip on his arm. He's trying to bury me. You think you're gonna walk out of this clean? But Aaliyah's voice cut through the noise. Mr. Callahan, sit down. The gavel didn't need to strike. Her tone was enough. Brent's hands trembled as he sat back down. Whatever performance he thought he could give, it was over. Doyle had torn away the last curtain, and there was nothing left but the truth. Camila turned to the jury. You've heard the stories. You've seen the evidence. And now, you've heard the confession, not just of what was done, but why. This wasn't about one bad decision. It was about a culture of cruelty disguised as policing. A system where people like Officer Callahan were allowed to act without consequence because no one had the courage to stand up. Until now. Aaliyah looked out at the courtroom, her expression unreadable but her eyes burning with clarity. The moment that had started with humiliation, with a laugh and a denial, had become something much bigger. This was no longer just about her. It was about all the people who had been silenced, dismissed, brutalized, and told they didn't belong. And now, they were being heard. Fully. Finally. She recessed the court for deliberation. As the jury filed out, Brent sat motionless, staring at nothing. Aaliyah stood, gathered her papers, and paused. Then she walked to the side of the bench where Doyle remained seated, waiting for instructions to leave. He looked up at her, visibly nervous. Why now? She asked quietly. He took a moment. Because watching him mock you that day, it made me realize I wasn't just a witness. I was part of the silence. She didn't answer right away. But then, with a quiet nod, she turned and left the room. Outside the courthouse, protesters had gathered. Not angry. Not chaotic. But solemn. Hopeful. Holding signs not of rage, but of truth. Signs that said let her speak and justice has a voice. Inside, the jury was preparing to deliberate. But the real verdict had already begun to echo in the hearts of everyone watching. Because now, the only thing left was to see what would become of the man who believed he would never be held accountable. The jurors sat in the deliberation room surrounded by silence, but it was the kind of silence that screamed. It pulsed. It pressed down on them, carrying the weight of everything they'd seen and heard over the past week. Testimonies, evidence, recordings, tears. The letter. Doyle's confession. And most of all, the final image burned into their minds, a man who once held authority, now unraveling in real time under the eyes of the woman he had tried to humiliate without ever knowing who she was. The room wasn't divided by race or age, but by something much deeper, moral clarity. And it didn't take long for consensus to rise. Not because the facts were simple, but because the truth had finally, undeniably, broken through the walls built to hide it. When they returned to the courtroom, the gallery sat in hushed anticipation. Reporters poised with their fingers trembling over keyboards. Community members filling every corner of the room, many of whom had only come to witness the verdict but ended up watching a reckoning unfold. Brent Callahan looked up only once, his eyes glassy, his mouth drawn into a tight line. No more confidence. No more defiance. Just a man watching his image collapse in front of him. Aaliyah sat poised behind the bench. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was a signal of permanence. She was not there for theatrics. She was there for justice, and everyone in the room knew it. The head juror stood and delivered the verdict, each word sharp and final. Guilty. On all counts. Brent didn't react. Not at first. He just sat still, hands folded, jaw set, his eyes blinking a little too quickly. The courtroom erupted softly, Not with cheers, but with breath. The kind of breath that had been held for far too long. The kind that only came when justice felt real, not promised. His lawyer touched his shoulder, but he didn't respond. His world, which had once moved on the axis of control and power, had tilted beyond his reach. But the story didn't end with a gavel. After the verdict, people wanted more than punishment. They wanted understanding. They wanted to know how it happened, how someone like Brent was able to rise and remain protected for so long. Aaliyah understood that urge. But she also knew something deeper. Justice wasn't just about a single verdict. It was about exposing what was buried, allowing it to rot in the open air, and choosing not to cover it back up. Later that evening, she sat in her chambers, the soft hum of fluorescent light buzzing above her. Malik stepped inside without knocking, carrying a folder of press inquiries and post-trial motions. "They want you on CNN," he said. "Morning shows. Nightline. Even podcasts. Everyone wants the judge who brought down the department." She didn't even look up. "Tell them no." Malik hesitated. "You sure?" "I'm not here to be a headline," she said. "I did my job." "But that's just it," he said, stepping forward, voice low and urgent. "You didn't just do your job. You did what no one else had the guts to. You stood there and didn't flinch when the whole city was watching. You made him answer. That matters." Aaliyah closed the folder slowly. She knew he was right. But she also knew how quickly stories like hers were digested, celebrated, and then forgotten. How quickly public applause turned to silence. She wasn't afraid of fading into the background, she was afraid that once the lights dimmed, the system would reset itself and nothing would truly change. Meanwhile, Doyle was placed under protective custody. His testimony had enraged members of the department who still believed in their loyalty codes more than the law itself. He gave up his badge voluntarily. In his official statement, he said he no longer felt worthy of wearing it. There was no celebration for him. No redemption arc. Just a quiet exit and a long road ahead. But it was a start. A beginning of reckoning that he had to carry on his own. Brent, awaiting sentencing, was placed under special observation. Not because of any public threat, but because he had become a symbol. For some, a scapegoat. For others, a monster. But in truth, he was neither. He was a symptom. And now, exposed and powerless, he was forced to sit in the same system he had once manipulated, now facing the weight of rules he thought would never apply to him. The department released a public statement condemning his actions, but few believed the sincerity. Internal Affairs opened new investigations into officers mentioned in Doyle's letter. Community leaders called for reforms. Some city officials resisted. Others embraced it as a political opportunity. But the public, especially those who had sat in that courtroom and witnessed what unfolded, were no longer willing to accept empty statements. They wanted change. And Aaliyah found herself at a crossroads. The media wanted her story. Protesters wanted her voice. Her inbox filled with messages of support, gratitude, and heartbreak. People shared their own stories of humiliation. Of injustice. Of being told to sit down and wait their turn. Some wrote to say thank you. Others to say, now I believe it's possible. She thought about her parents often during those days. Her father, who used to drive her past courthouses and tell her, one day, you'll be the one giving orders in there. Her mother, who stayed up late helping her study for the bar even while working 2 jobs. She thought about all the times she had almost quit. Almost broken. And now, standing on the other side of the fire, she asked herself the question that lingered deeper than any verdict: what now? One evening, as she left the courthouse through the main entrance, this time in full robes, surrounded by no one, she passed through the same security checkpoint where it all began. A different officer stood there now. Younger. Black. Polite. He nodded respectfully as she walked past. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The moment carried everything. Outside, a small group of onlookers clapped quietly. No chance. No cameras. Just people who had come to see her. One woman stepped forward. She looked to be in her 60s, with silver coils and a slow, tired smile. She handed Aaliyah a handwritten note. "For when you need reminding," she said softly. Later, Aaliyah opened it in her car. It read, "You didn't just judge him. You reminded us that we matter." And yet, deep inside, Aaliyah carried a complexity that wouldn't dissolve with applause. She knew that justice, once served, often fades from public consciousness long before the wounds it aimed to heal ever close. She knew there would be backlash. That people would question her neutrality, her professionalism, her motives. That Brent's defenders would frame her as vindictive, emotional, unfit. She knew that tomorrow, someone else would be humiliated at a door they rightfully belonged behind. But she also knew something else, something that grounded her every time doubt tried to creep in. That sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand still in a moment where you are expected to break. That sometimes, simply being seen is revolutionary. And that, even if the world forgets, truth remembers. The sentencing was scheduled for the following week. There were whispers that Brent's defense would attempt to appeal, to claim misconduct, to rewrite the narrative. But Aaliyah had been careful. She had walked every step of that trial with precision, integrity, and grace. There was nothing to challenge. The truth was already sealed in transcripts, in testimonies, in that video played in open court. And now, as the city awaited the final judgment, Aaliyah stood before her mirror, tying her robe at the waist, steadying her breath. Not as a symbol. Not as a victor. But as a woman who had once been told to sit down and wait, and who chose instead to rise and speak. The day before sentencing, the courthouse halls were quieter than usual, but the quiet wasn't peace, it was pressure, waiting to be released. The kind of stillness that filled lungs and thoughts with the heaviness of everything unresolved. The courtroom itself sat empty for now, chairs neatly aligned, the bench looming silently over the scene like a monument to everything that had taken place within those walls. Outside, the city of Atlanta carried on as it always did, but within that building, lives were shifting in ways that couldn't be undone. Aaliyah arrived early that morning, her robe folded over her arm, not yet ready to wear the weight of authority. She moved slowly through the hallways, taking in the stillness with each step, remembering how different the world had felt just a week ago. Everything had changed, and yet, everything looked the same. That was the strange thing about justice, it didn't come with fireworks or music, it didn't paint the walls a new color. It just was, heavy and invisible and necessary. She sat in her chambers, the blinds drawn, the low hum of the city muffled by thick glass and silence. Malik entered with 2 cups of coffee and placed one gently on her desk. His face was tired, but there was something settled in his posture, a quiet pride that hadn't been there before. He didn't speak at first. Neither of them did. Then, softly, he said, "I read the op-ed." Aaliyah looked up, confused for a second, until she remembered the article. One of the jurors had submitted a personal piece to a local paper titled "The Day Justice Looked Like Me." She hadn't read it yet. Malik continued, "He wrote about you. About how, for the first time, he didn't feel afraid to speak truth in that room. He said your silence, your stillness, made it feel safe." She listened quietly, then turned her eyes toward the window. "Isn't that ironic?" she said. "That silence is what made them feel safe, when so many have been silenced for years and never felt safety at all." He didn't respond right away. Then, with a careful voice, he said, "Maybe it wasn't the silence. Maybe it was the control. You didn't need to raise your voice to be heard. That's what changed things." A knock came at the door before she could answer. It was Doyle. His presence was unexpected, but not unwelcome. He stood with a hesitant posture, as if unsure whether he should have come at all. Aaliyah invited him in with a nod. He stepped inside slowly, eyes darting toward Malik, then back to her. "I won't take much of your time," he said. I needed to say something before tomorrow." Aaliyah folded her hands on the desk, listening. "I don't expect forgiveness," Doyle began, "and I'm not asking for it. But I've been trying to live with myself, and it's harder than I thought. I lied. I looked away. And I stood by that man because it was easier than standing alone." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. "But watching him mock you, dismiss you like that, it broke something in me. Not just because it was wrong. But because I realized I had done the same to others. Maybe not with words, but with silence. And silence cuts just as deep." Aaliyah didn't blink. She took in every word, not with anger, but with the same quiet force that had defined her throughout the entire trial. When she finally responded, her voice was low and sure. "I don't forgive what you were part of," she said. "But I can respect that you chose to stop being part of it. That matters." Doyle looked down, a mix of shame and relief clouding his features. "I just hope it's not too late to do something right." "It never is," she replied. "But right is never easy. And it's never fast." He nodded, wiped at the corner of his eye, then excused himself. After he left, Malik stood by the window, looking out at the skyline. "You think he'll be okay?" Aaliyah leaned back in her chair. "I think he'll have to carry what he did. That's his sentence. But he'll carry it awake. That's more than most." The next morning, the courtroom was full again. Not packed like during the peak of the trial, but filled with the kind of people who needed to witness closure. Brent Callahan was escorted in through a side door, wrists shackled discreetly, face hardened into something unreadable. His posture was straighter than before, as if he had rehearsed strength in the mirror, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed him. The prosecutor read the sentencing recommendations. Aaliyah listened, steady as ever, hands folded, face unreadable. The defense asked for leniency, citing Brent's years of service, his prior clean record, his family's suffering. They spoke of reputation, of redemption, of how no man should be defined by his worst mistake. And then it was Brent's turn. He stood slowly, turning to face the bench. For the first time, he spoke not as the confident officer, not as the man with the badge or the man on trial, but as someone who had lost control, and perhaps, a piece of himself. "I've been thinking about what I'd say," he began. "I've gone over it 100 times. Some version where I explain myself, where I justify what I did, what I didn't do. But I've realized none of it matters. Because what I said, what I did, the people I hurt, it's all on record now." His voice shook, and he looked briefly at the people in the gallery before returning his gaze to Aaliyah. "I didn't see you that day. Not really. I saw what I wanted to see. What I was taught to see. And that's the problem. I thought I was keeping people safe, but I was protecting a version of safety that never included people who looked like you." He paused, eyes glassy. "And I know that saying this now doesn't change what I did. I don't expect sympathy. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see you. I see them." He gestured toward the crowd. "And I don't know if I can fix what I broke. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying." The courtroom remained silent. There were no murmurs, no responses. Just the sound of truth sitting in the room, real and raw. Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment, then slowly stood. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice even, yet filled with unspoken weight. "You were given power. Not just the kind that comes with a badge or a gun, but the power of trust. Of belief. And you broke that trust. Not once. Not by mistake. But by choice. Again and again. For years." She looked around the courtroom, then back at him. "The people you hurt may never fully heal. The lives you disrupted, the fear you instilled, the dignity you stripped away, those things don't just vanish with time. They live in the silence of their homes, in the tension of their breaths when sirens pass, in the way their children are taught to shrink. Brent lowered his head. But you also now carry something you never expected to, accountability. And that is justice, not vengeance. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will be remanded immediately. The gavel struck once. Firm. Final. And then the room exhaled. As Brent was escorted out, his face void of resistance, something in the crowd shifted. Not joy. Not satisfaction. But release. Like a door had opened. Like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of something new. As Aaliyah walked back through the hallways, past reporters and flashes of light, she thought not of victory, but of resilience. Of every girl who had been told to wait their turn. Of every man who had been told he was a threat because he existed. Of every mother who had held her child through the storm and said, one day, it'll be different. And maybe, for once, it was. When the courtroom finally emptied, and the city slowly began returning to the rhythm it always fell into after a headline faded, Aaliyah remained seated in her chambers. The sentencing was over, but the echo of it lived in her bones. The weight of the gavel still pulsed in her hand even though it had long been set down on the desk. What lingered wasn't triumph, it was something more complex, more human. A mixture of exhaustion, vindication, sorrow, and the quiet hum of responsibility. Malik stood across the room, watching her with a silence that spoke volumes. He had walked beside her through each step of this case, not as an assistant, but as a witness to the emotional labor she had endured without showing it. He leaned against the doorframe and finally said, "You didn't just sentence him. You sentenced an entire idea. One a lot of people thought would never die." Aaliyah looked up, slowly, her gaze distant but sharp. "Did I?" she asked. "Or did I just give them someone to blame so they wouldn't have to look at themselves?" He crossed the room and sat across from her. "You did what no one else would have done. That matters. Even if they only remember it for a week. Even if they try to rewrite the story, they'll never change what happened inside that room." She nodded faintly, but her eyes were already drifting toward the stack of letters piling up beside her desk. Letters from survivors, from activists, from anonymous strangers sharing their stories, their wounds, their gratitude. Some letters were filled with tears in ink, others with rage, others with hope that this moment meant something more than just one man facing consequences. Aaliyah had read many of them late at night, sometimes sitting in the dark, her fingers tracing the lines as if touching pain through paper. One in particular haunted her, a letter from a high school student named Tasha, who wrote, "I saw you up there, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was pretending to belong." That line echoed through her over and over, more than any article or news headline, because it reminded her exactly why she had chosen this path in the first place. Later that evening, Aaliyah met with Camila Rojas in a quiet cafe a few blocks from the courthouse. It wasn't official. No press. No statements. Just two women who had stood on the same battlefield, finally able to breathe without preparing for the next blow. Camila stirred her tea slowly, the clinking of the spoon barely audible over the soft jazz playing overhead. She looked tired in a way that coffee couldn't fix, but her eyes held the same fire that had carried her through every word she'd spoken in court. "You know it's not over," she said, not as a warning, but as a truth. Aaliyah nodded. "I know. He'll appeal. There'll be backlash. People will question the verdict, question me." Camila set her spoon down and leaned in slightly. "They can question your methods all they want. But they can't question your integrity. And no one in that room will forget what they saw. That's what scares them most." Aaliyah took a sip of her drink, letting the warmth settle in her throat before speaking. "What scares me is that they'll forget too quickly. That once the headlines fade, the same officers will walk the same streets with the same mindset." Camila sighed. "Change doesn't come from one case. But it starts with one truth. And this was that. A hard one. A necessary one. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the city outside brushing faintly against the windows. When they parted ways, they didn't say goodbye. They just nodded, two warriors stepping back into a world that still needed fighting. Meanwhile, the department was unraveling in slow, uncomfortable waves. Internal Affairs had launched broader investigations following Doyle's confession. A few officers quietly resigned. Others were reassigned. Some fought back, filing grievances, rallying support from those who still believed they were being targeted unfairly. But the public wasn't so easily swayed anymore. The footage had done something irreversible. It had stripped away plausible deniability. It had made people look. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Aaliyah walked through the courthouse a few days later and noticed something strange. People moved differently around her now. Some nodded with respect, others with caution. A few avoided her gaze entirely. It wasn't admiration. It was discomfort. Because her presence now reminded people of accountability. And that was rarely welcomed. She was on her way to meet the chief judge, called in for a post-trial debrief. She expected questions. Maybe subtle reprimands masked as protocol. Maybe praise laced with strategic warnings. But what she didn't expect was sincerity. The chief, an older white man named Harrington with decades of service behind him, sat behind a thick oak desk. He didn't look like someone who changed easily. But when she entered, he stood. And when he gestured for her to sit, he looked at her not as a subordinate, but as a peer. "I wanted to say thank you," he began, his voice more fragile than she remembered. "Not just for how you handled the trial. But for reminding us why we sit where we sit." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, unsure whether to trust the sentiment. "I won't pretend I saw it coming," Harrington continued. "And I won't lie and say I agreed with every call you made in that courtroom. But I watched the footage. I read the transcripts. And what you did, it was necessary. Even if it made people uncomfortable." She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "The law was always meant to make the comfortable uncomfortable. That's how you know it's working." He let out a soft breath, part chuckle, part concession. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time we all started getting used to that." They talked for nearly an hour. Not about Brent. Not about press. But about systems. About what had allowed someone like Brent to rise without friction. About policies that protected power instead of people. And by the end of the conversation, there was no promises of change, but there was an opening. A crack in the stone. A possibility. When Aaliyah returned home that night, she found her mother waiting on the porch. Her mother didn't visit often. Age had slowed her, and memories came in fragments now. But this evening, she was sharp. Her eyes clear. She stood as Aaliyah approached, and they embraced for longer than usual. No words. Just presence. Inside, they sat in the kitchen with tea and cornbread, and eventually, her mother spoke. "I saw you," she said. "On the news. Heard what that man said about you. About all of us." Aaliyah didn't respond right away. "I was proud," her mother continued. "Not because you put him away. But because you did it without turning into him. That landed like a weight. A kind of weight that settled not as burden, but as recognition." "I almost did," Aaliyah whispered. "There were moments I wanted to. Moments I wanted him to feel everything I've felt." Her mother reached across the table, her hand weathered, strong. "That's the trap. They want us to lose ourselves in the fight. But you didn't. You stood. And you let them see us." That night, Aaliyah sat alone in her living room, light spilling through half-open blinds. The city moved outside, cars buzzing, life unfolding. She turned over Tasha's letter again and again, the words now etched into her like scripture. She thought of Doyle, of Camilla, of Brent. Of every name whispered in testimony. Every tear that had fallen on that witness stand. Every unspoken story still waiting to be heard. And she realized, justice had no finish line. It had ripples. And she was now part of that tide. In the months that followed the verdict, the story that had once dominated headlines began to quiet. The protests thinned, the news crews moved on, and the city of Atlanta returned to its familiar rhythms. But beneath the surface, something lasting had shifted. People walked differently through the courthouse now. They looked longer at badges and uniforms. They asked more questions. Whispers became conversations, and conversations became calls for reform. A slow, stubborn movement had begun, one not born of outrage alone, but of undeniable evidence and a judge who had refused to shrink in the face of disrespect. Aaliyah continued her work on the bench, but the weight of her presence carried more than authority now, it carried expectation. She began receiving invitations to speak at law schools, to train new judges, to participate in oversight committees aiming to investigate systemic bias within the criminal justice system. She accepted the ones that mattered. The ones where change didn't just sound good on paper, but had the potential to rewrite it entirely. Her voice wasn't just needed, it was now part of the standard. She no longer entered rooms needing to prove herself. She entered with the kind of presence that made others check their assumptions before speaking. One afternoon, she stood before a classroom of third-year law students, mostly black and brown, many of them first-generation scholars. She told them the story, not the headline version, but the full truth. About how the system doesn't change when we wait our turn quietly. It changes when we show up anyway. When we force ourselves into the rooms we were told weren't built for us, and when we bring others in behind us. One student, eyes wide and full of that raw, unshaped fire, asked her what had given her the strength not to retaliate. Aaliyah paused, then smiled faintly and said, "Because dignity is louder than vengeance. And power without restraint isn't power. It's fear dressed up in a badge." The room fell into an awed silence. That moment, small, off-camera, was one of the most defining of her journey. Because it wasn't about what she had done. It was about what she had made possible for others. Brent Callahan served his sentence in a medium-security federal prison in North Carolina. His appeal was swiftly denied. The attempt to paint his trial as a personal vendetta collapsed under the weight of transcripts, footage, and his own recorded words. Inside, he became known more by his case number than his name. The authority he once wielded so easily now replaced by a silence that lingered in the air around him like shame. In prison, he was forced into mandatory racial bias training and restorative justice programs. He resisted at first. Blamed everyone. The system. The department. The world. But slowly, over time, as letters stopped coming and visits dried up, something inside him cracked open. Whether it was true remorse or simply the mirror he was finally forced to face, no one could be sure. But when he was asked one day by a prison counselor what he would do differently if he could go back, he didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. Then, softly, he said, "I'd listen. That's it. I'd just listen." It wasn't redemption. But it was a beginning. One he'd have to walk alone. Doyle left law enforcement. Quietly. Without ceremony. He relocated to a smaller town upstate and began working as a crisis counselor for at-risk youth. He didn't speak much about his past, but when he did, it was never to make excuses. It was to warn. To teach. To show how easy it was to become part of the problem when you convince yourself that silence is survival. His work wasn't public. He never sought credit. But in the eyes of the boys he helped keep out of the system he once fed, there was understanding. And in that, he found something that resembled peace. Camila Rojas was promoted. She became the head of a newly formed civil rights enforcement unit, tasked with prosecuting law enforcement misconduct at the federal level. Her fire never dimmed, but now it was aimed with even greater precision. She carried with her not just experience, but a living memory of a case that had once felt impossible, and the knowledge that the right people in the right positions can turn the tide. She and Aaliyah stayed in touch. Two women on parallel paths, bound by the memory of a courtroom where history had briefly cracked open and let the truth step through. And Tasha, the young girl who had written that letter, was now applying for pre-law programs. Aaliyah had responded to her personally, inviting her to shadow her in chambers for a day. They walked the same hall where it all began, the same entrance where Aaliyah had once been mocked and dismissed. Now she entered flanked by students who saw her not just as a judge, but as a reflection of their own potential. The very space that had once tried to shrink her now expanded with every step she took inside it. But perhaps the most powerful ending wasn't public at all. One quiet Sunday, Aaliyah returned to Birmingham to visit her father's grave. The cemetery was almost empty. The wind soft, the trees dancing gently in the early spring sun. She knelt beside the stone and placed a single copy of the trial transcript beside it. Bound. Neatly typed. A symbol. Her hand rested on the cool marble, and for a long time, she didn't speak. Then she whispered, "You were right, Daddy. I didn't just make it in, I made it matter." And that was the closure she hadn't known she needed. This story is not just about a judge, or a corrupt officer, or a courtroom battle. It's about what we allow, what we challenge, and how we respond when dignity is stripped in plain sight. It's about the people who stand up not to punish, but to restore. About how accountability is not revenge, it's repair. And how sometimes, the greatest justice isn't found in a sentence, but in the ripple it creates after the gavel falls. Now let me ask you, the one listening right now, how many times have you been underestimated? How many moments in your life have you been told to sit down, to wait, to prove yourself just a little more? And when that moment came, did you choose silence, or did you choose to stand? Let us know in the comments, what part of this story hit you the hardest? What would you have done if you were in Aaliyah's place? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it sparked something inside you, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that shake the ground beneath injustice and lift the voices that need to be heard. And if you haven't already, hit that like button. Not just because it helps us, but because stories like this deserve to be seen. Thank you for staying with us. And remember, sometimes, the most powerful twist is truth.